Hello W130 students, this is Erin Kelly and I'm here today to provide a short video presentation on how to use quotes. So I have other video presentations on choosing quotes, actually selecting quotes from the text itself, and another video presentation on the mechanics of MLA, so basically how to um, cite a quote in text. But this is more about the textual framework that you should provide when you pull a quote into your own essay and into your own writing. So we're going to quickly go over this framework and I'll show you some examples at the end. So when you pull a quote into your own writing, the key thing to remember is that you don't just want to plop the quote into a paragraph arbitrarily. You want to make sure you provide a framework for that quote. And in first year writing classes, we call that framework the 3 I's. These steps include introducing your quote, integrating your quotes, and then interpreting your quote. So I'm going to talk about what those things mean. The introducing step involves imagining your audience. So you want to pretend you're writing for smart, educated people that can understand big concepts and issues, but at the same time, you want to pretend you're writing for a reader who has never read the essay you are quoting. So you want to make sure you slow down and provide plenty of background information before you bring in the quote. The quote's really not going to work for you very effectively if your reader can't understand it as they read it. So they really require that background information. So in sort of more tangible terms, this involves providing a sentence or phrase before the quote to sort of situate it in a time and place, let your reader know what the author's discussing in the passages that surround the quote, so they're not at all confused when they read the quote itself. So here you might tell the reader who's speaking. You know probably from previous lectures or from your teacher that you want to use the author's full name and the full title of the essay the first time you mention them in the introduction, but usually you don't use quotes in the introduction of your essay unless maybe it's a quick quote to define a key term. Usually it's your body paragraphs where you're using quotations, and so typically you've already introduced the author in text, and here you likely want to just refer to the author by last name only. So in that way, you're telling your reader who in fact is speaking, that these aren't your words. You tell your reader what's going on in the essay at the time of the quote itself, and maybe emphasize, highlight, explain any key terms or ideas that are really important in the quote and that might not make sense to your reader. The next step, and the second of our 3 I's, is the integration step. And this basically involves pulling the quotation into the grammar of your own sentences, making sure it reads smoothly with your sentences that surround it. So this can be a pretty simple process, or sort of depending on what you're trying to do, it could be a bit more complicated. So the simple way to do this is if you're pulling in a quote that's a complete sentence, you can often integrate it into the grammar of the surrounding sentences using a simple signal phrase that just sort of acknowledges that these aren't your words and lets your reader know who's speaking. Columbo argues, and then you provide the quote. Davidson suggests, she states, he explains, they acknowledge, the authors insist. You want to be a bit careful about word choice here. You don't want to get too fancy. My advice to students is always to keep it simple. If you get fancy and use words like Columbo explicates or Davidson illuminates, it can almost bog down your sentences rather than working to clarify your quotes and pull them smoothly into the surrounding text. The other thing is, depending on the words you choose, you're implying certain things. So if you say the authors insist, that might suggest maybe you're going to argue against what the authors are saying. So you want to be a bit thoughtful here as you create your signal phrases. These are a pretty simple way to integrate quotes into the grammar of the surrounding sentences. As you get more comfortable with this, if you're pulling in partial sentences, fragments, or phrases, you might actually need to alter the language in the quote. So we all know at this point, if you have quotations around a block of text, you're telling your reader that you have pulled the language word for word from the source text. It's exactly as it appears in your textbook. However, you can alter the words slightly using these tools. This square bracket allows you to add a word to a quote, or even a phrase sometimes, and this ellipses, these 3 dots, allow you to remove a word from a quote. The main thing to keep in mind here is that you only want to use this method if you're certain you're not changing the meaning of the original quotation. So one of the quickest ways to derail the success of your essay and make it not as meaningful, not as successful, is if you misconstrue or misinterpret what the author's saying in the quote. The same holds true here. You don't want to alter the quote so much that you're not staying true to what the author meant. But if you just want to make the quote flow more smoothly with the surrounding sentences, you can add a word using the square brackets, or take a word away, or even a whole sentence or phrase away from the middle of a longer passage if it helps you, using these ellipses. And I'm going to show you some examples in a minute. Sometimes, as you get more comfortable with this, you may use a combination of these strategies. Use the signal phrase and maybe take a phrase out of the middle of a longer passage that you want to quote using your ellipses here. So that's the integration step. The third of our 3 I's is the interpretation step, and this involves providing a sentence or two after the quote where you explain what the quote means in your own words. So basically, here is your opportunity to teach the readers what you want them to understand about the quote. I often tell students, if you miss this step, you're missing a real opportunity to sort of emphasize the aspects of the quote that you think are important and move into your own argument. So again, here you can describe why the quote's important to your argument, your thesis, and maybe even move into your explanation of how the quote connects with the other ideas in the paragraph. But you're looking at the words and ideas in the quote and discussing what they mean. Some examples of bad interpretation include sort of qualitative judgments. This quote is good. This is a good, true quote, or I agree with this quote. It's not so much about the quality here. Good quotes speak for themselves. And we know you think the quote is good or true typically because you picked it and you pulled it into your writing. So instead, you again want to look at the words and ideas in the quote and analyze and interpret what they mean for your reader. Help your reader to understand the quote. You know you've run into a problem if all you can do at this stage is sort of just repeat what the quote just said. You can't come up with your own words to convey what the quote means. That might suggest that the quote you've selected is just too simple. There's not enough content for you to really sink your teeth into and analyze and interpret the quote. That means you might want to go back to your text, revisit it a little bit, and see if you can pick a quote that has more substance. Okay, so that's the third of the 3 I's. So first you're providing a sentence or phrase before the quote to situate it in a time and place and provide some background information on the passages that surround the quote. Then you're integrating the quote, pulling it into the grammar of your own sentences. Then you're interpreting the quote by providing a sentence or two after the quote to explain what the quote means in your own words. Quick things to avoid. Always in academic writing and in most styles of writing, you want to avoid I language and things like I think, I feel, I believe. This is implied. You're the author. We know these are your thoughts, feelings, or beliefs. So you want to drop this type of language from your academic writing, particularly as you're trying to interpret your quotes. You know you want to avoid beginning or ending a paragraph with a quote because you've missed some of the vital framework we've been discussing here. If you begin a paragraph with a quote, then you know you've missed that introduction and integration step. If you end a paragraph with a quote, then you know you've missed the interpretation or explanation, the sentence or two that should follow the quote, explaining what the quote means in your own words. Another thing to avoid is any quote that's longer than 4 typed lines. In MLA, a quote that's longer than 4 typed lines is considered a block quote, and it needs to be formatted entirely differently than standard quotations. Typically in W130 classes, I advise my students to avoid block quotes entirely. If you find a quote that you're really interested in using, call me aside or call your teacher aside if it's longer than 4 typed lines, and I can give you some advice. But for now, we're just learning these things. We probably want to avoid quotes that long. And again, you want to avoid analyzing the quality of a quote, remembering that you're looking at the words and ideas in the quote and discussing what they mean, rather than just saying this is a good quote or this is a true quote. So quickly, here are some examples of what we've just been discussing. Here's a quote integrated sort of in a pretty standard way using a signal phrase. First, we have, this quote is from Colombo's introductory essay to Rereading America, where he talks about culture and how it influences our thinking. And we've pulled a quote where he sort of defines this big key term in his essay, cultural myths. So we've got an introductory sentence saying, Colombo discusses that culture is so powerful that it influences our view of the world around us without our awareness, the introduction step. He states, we accept ways of looking at the world, ways of thinking and being, that might best be characterized as cultural frames of reference or cultural myths. So So we've got a really basic integration move here, just acknowledging that these aren't our words, they're Columbo's. And then we've got a sentence that follows interpreting the quote. In other words, Columbo defines cultural myths as powerful frames that influence our thinking and behavior. So again, here we get to help our reader understand the quote and emphasize the words and ideas in the quote that might be particularly important to our argument, like cultural myths. Here, we pulled it down into our explanation, our interpretation. Obviously, it's not word for word, but we're pulling some of the words and ideas in the quote down, and we're discussing what those concepts mean.